Deep within the architecture of the human mind lies a state akin to a labyrinth. It is a place of primordial confinement, a condition where the nascent ego first slumbers, trapped in an absolute, unconscious identity with the self. In this initial state, true consciousness does not yet exist. The ego remains unborn, entirely merged with the vast, ancient architecture of the psyche in a condition of primary identity. To remain here is to remain a captive of the Ouroboros state, an original wholeness where the mind is endlessly contained within its own darkness. But the psyche inherently demands evolution and a violent break from this passive, original wholeness. The myth presents us with Daedalus, who constructs the instruments of liberation. He builds wings, providing the capacity for flight, which represents the mechanism by which the ego might finally separate from its dark, unconscious origins. To take flight is to enact a profound psychological transition, moving from a passive state into an active, inflated deed. It is the ego's necessary rebellion against the reigning authorities that bind it. Yet, this daring act carries the ultimate risk, initiating a journey into the dangerous expanse between the heavens and the abyss. Before the ascent, Daedalus imparts a critical warning to his son, Icarus, establishing the necessity of the golden mean. This delicate balance is required for the survival of the newly awakened, soaring ego. Do not set your own course, the father warns, urging dependence on superior wisdom over foolhardy autonomy. To fly too low is to risk the dampening of the wings in the turbulent waters of the sea. In the realm of the psyche, this dangerously low flight mirrors the state of alienation. Pause it is a condition of profound depression, a heavy, paralyzing despair where the ego loses all vital connection to the self, resulting in terrifying emptiness and meaninglessness. But to fly too high, ascending too close to the burning sun, is an even greater peril. As Ovid's poetic parallel of Phaeton warns, venturing too high threatens to set fire to the heavens, while the middle course remains the only path of safety. The sun represents the blinding, transpersonal power of the collective unconscious. To fly into the sun is to succumb entirely to ego inflation. It is the psychological state where the fragile, mortal ego arrogates to itself the qualities of the divine, blowing itself up beyond the limits of its proper size. Pause the ego, intoxicated by its new altitude, mistakenly believes itself to be the supreme center of the universe. And so the flight begins, and the ego leaves the labyrinth of the unconscious, experiencing the sudden, exhilarating rush of autonomy. Icarus becomes so overwhelmed by the sheer thrill and ability to fly that he forgets the crucial warning of the father. For the first time, the ego feels the intoxicating, yet dangerous, power of its own supposed independence. As Ovid's poetry reminds us, the heavens are carried round with a constant, rapid revolution. To navigate this cosmic space is to contend with a terrifying force that overcomes all other things. It requires immense reverence and a profound respect for the limits of the human mind against the whirling poles of the sky. But Icarus is blinded by his own exhilaration, actively setting his own disastrous course. He becomes mesmerized by the boundless expanse of the sky, falling victim to the insidious nature of inflation. The ego becomes vain, presumptuous, and distended with an unreal sense of importance, soaring far beyond its mortal boundaries. He no longer sees himself as a mere fragment of the whole, but believes he is the entirety of the self. This is the arrogant delusion of omnipotence, an attribute that belongs only to the divine. In his reckless flight, Icarus identifies completely with the archetype of the deity, attempting to appropriate transpersonal energies for his own personal glory. The ancient Greeks had a specific name for this fatal overstepping of human limitations, calling it hubris. Hubris is the insolence of irreverence, the arrogant brutality of strength that passes all unseen barriers. It is a blind pride that fails to see the insurmountable chasm between mortal man and the divine powers. To commit the crime of hubris is to awaken a terrifying, inevitable cosmic reaction known as nemesis. The psychological law dictates that any conscious personality attempting to go too far without taking the unconscious into account will be violently checked. Whatever goes up in artificial inflation must inevitably be brought down. As Icarus approaches the solar deity, the heat becomes unbearable, and the wax on his wings begins to melt. The wax represents the fragile provisional structure that binds the newly formed ego together, which cannot withstand the burning flames. The conscious personality cannot sustain a direct, unfiltered encounter with the raw, numinous power of the archetypal psyche. The delusion of godhood shatters as the artificial wings dissolve into the thin air. The inflated ego, having foolishly cast away its humble servitude to the deeper self, now finds itself stripped of all mechanical support. The individual is left utterly powerless against the gravitational pull of reality. There is a moment of pure, agonizing clarity where the ego realizes it is not the master of its own house. The flight was a temporary, Luciferian theft of power, and the devastating price of that heroic crime is now due. The unyielding forces of nature and destiny reassert their absolute dominance. Then comes the fall, which is an abrupt, violent plunge from the heights of grandiosity. When a person is caught in an inflated state, the psychological collapse is not a gentle drifting, but a terrifying, uncontrolled plummet into the abyss. It is a jarring descent that violently strips away all illusions of supremacy. As depicted in Pieter Bruegel's famous painting of the fall, the world remains entirely indifferent to the catastrophe of the inflated ego. The plowman continues to plow, and the ships sail on, ignoring the boy disappearing into the water. The internal, archetypal tragedy of the psyche goes completely unnoticed by the collective, external reality. The impact with the sea is a brutal, dangerously jarring collision with reality. The sea represents the dark, cold, unfathomable depths of the unconscious mind. The ego, which arrogantly sought to conquer the heavens, is violently swallowed by the very waters it sought to transcend. This descent into the waters is the agonizing state of alienation. The ego is plunged into the dark night of the soul, stripped of its previous heights. It is a condition of profound despair, a feeling of utter worthlessness, and a complete disconnection from the vital, life-giving center of the psyche. Here in the crushing, restrictive depths, the ego experiences the terrible weight of its own limitation and mortality. It is an experience of being a solitary, fragmented entity, utterly stripped of all previous illusions of transpersonal power. The individual is left as a mere heap of broken images in a sterile wasteland. Yet, according to depth psychology, this devastating fall is not merely a cruel punishment, but an absolute prerequisite for true consciousness. The original, inflated state of the ego had to be shattered to prevent a permanent, pathological megalomania. The destruction of the false self makes room for the birth of something genuine. The acquisition of consciousness is always initiated as a necessary crime against the natural, unconscious state of wholeness. It is a necessary alienation that requires the ego to be wounded. The ego must be dismembered and humbled in order to eventually be reassembled on a higher, more authentic plane of existence. Through the agonizing pain of the fall, the individual is violently forced to abandon the provisional life of childish irresponsibility. Only in the depths of this despair can the ego begin the slow, arduous work of discovering the true ego-self axis. Meaning must be desperately sought and regained from the darkness. The true self is not the ego, and the ego must accept its strictly subordinate position. It must humbly recognize that it is merely the subjective center of consciousness, while the self remains the objective, supreme authority of the total psyche. This realization is the painful birth of psychological maturity. To survive and thrive, the ego must ultimately find the golden mean. It must learn to fly the middle course, diligently avoiding the scorching heat of inflation and the drowning despair of alienation. It must establish a conscious, respectful dialogue with the unconscious without being consumed by its immense power. This delicate, conscious balance is the ultimate goal of the individuation process. The shattering of Icarus represents the necessary shattering of our own infantile, omnipotent illusions. It is the painful sacrifice of our delusion of godhood, enabling us to become truly, authentically human. The fall from the sky is therefore not the end, but rather a violent, necessary awakening. It is the profound realization that while the architecture of the ego is fragile and easily melted, the foundation of the self is eternal. The labyrinth is escaped not by becoming a god, but by accepting one's mortal limits. The dark sea awaits all who dare to separate from the unconscious. We must all endure the shattering of our inflated wings, plunging into the depths of our own limitations. For it is only through surviving the waters of alienation that we finally learn how to truly exist as individuated beings. Welcome to the Opisys Chronicles.